The first season of True Detective is one of my favorite realistic depictions of cosmic horror, and it's hard to think of any other media that comes even close to the feeling of dread this series gives me. The only thing I can think of is Fincher's work with Seven and Mindhunter, which are also fantastic works that I could talk about in the future, but the point stands that cosmic horror is really hard to do right, especially if you're limited by realistic fiction, and yet, the first season of True Detective is unmatched. It's genuinely one of the most brilliant horror stories ever told, feeling like an 8-hour classic movie more so than a TV show. I mean, what can I even say that hasn't already been said by several others on YouTube? That its terrifying depiction of nihilism, brilliant dialogue, and cinematography is absolutely stellar? That Rust Cohle is one of the most complex and fascinating characters ever? That its opening is just so goddamn good with the editing? Well, yeah, those are all things I'd love to gush about, and I might in this video because it deserves to be said, but really the heart of True Detective is the dynamic between both Rust and Marty, and how they're basically two sides of the same coin. One of the most common and often oversaturated tropes in cop dramas is the detective duo. Someone fresh and new partners up with someone a little more experienced. The two of them have completely different views on justice, and have a hard time respecting each other as a result. Over the course of the investigation, this slowly begins to change as they gain a better understanding of each other. Usually this is meant to display the juxtaposition of old methods versus new to establish the ever-changing system and the various struggles that come with finding anything even slightly resembling good police work. But in the case of True Detective, it's very different. In similar fashion to other shows like The Wire, True Detective is brutally honest in its depiction of police work, with Marty and Rust feeling like a nihilistic reflection of that. This time, instead, choosing to juxtapose a deeply flawed and arrogant man with a deeply flawed and broken one.
You got a demon, little man. And I don't like your face. It makes me want to do things to it.
Talking about Rust Cohle is kind of hard because everyone loves him. He's hard not to love. And in my opinion, it's Matthew McConaughey's best role he's ever done. Confrontational, jaded, and cynical in the world, Rust Cohle is the perfect embodiment of nihilism and self-hatred. He's a cynic and an anti-natalist, believing human consciousness and self-awareness to be one of the greatest mistakes. We shouldn't exist, and the honorable thing for us to do would be to let ourselves go extinct, but it's also clear that much of this is just a cover-up, a weak attempt at hiding his inner turmoil. His daughter is dead, his wife left him, and now he's all alone to face this cruel world. As a consequence, he chooses to reflect it, look deep into that dark abyss, and do whatever it takes to hunt down evil, even if it means ignoring protocol and breaking the law. He isn't exactly a kind person, and he makes it clear to others how he feels about them, almost as a form of self-harm. He doesn't care what happens to him, which can be seen by his extremely unhealthy habits. Various points throughout the season, you can see him abusing drugs and drinking a lot. During these confession videos, he demands that they get him some beer, mostly so anything he says in this video can't be used against him due to him being inebriated. It's never without reason, like when he does drugs so he can infiltrate a biker gang, or when he tries to get a deal on some Quaaludes because he suffers from insomnia. The only real purposeless habit he's developed is his addiction to cigarettes. Rust smokes a lot in this show, and every time he does, he refuses to inhale, as if keeping all of that smoke deep inside of him, which itself correlates with his pain. It's a form of self-harm, and one that he abuses consistently throughout the show, as if taking all of the world's darkness inside of himself and keeping it there. Rust also has bizarre hallucinations, where he sees weird color patterns and sometimes even a cloud of death. Though you could look at them as just visions of a broken man, they could also be seen as a direction of a higher power, leading him through this case bit by bit, and serving as a direct contradiction to his cynical beliefs, which are challenged over and over again as the case takes its course. What else can I even say about him that hasn't been said by plenty of other video essayists on the internet? To be honest, not much. Rust is a man who is never disappointed by the world because he never expects better of it. He's a man who has seen how truly awful this world is and lives content with it because of his low expectations, and only from there can he find a truly realistic form of hope. But he refuses to back down from it, no matter how terrible things might get.
I won't avert my eyes. Not again.
But it should be known that this attitude is not one of stoicism. In fact, it's the exact opposite. He might be able to expect it, but it doesn't mean that he accepts it, instead choosing to face it head on. The police that he answers to are indifferent because they avert their eyes from that which they cannot control, and they punish Rust for not adopting this cowardly mindset. Spent time in exile before deciding he can't sit by and watch things unfold anymore. Yes, he is mostly doing this for himself, but also out of a feeling of obligation for those children that have been hurt. Marty, on the other hand, is the exact opposite to Rust. Nobody ever really appreciates how nuanced Marty is as a character because of how brilliant Rust is, and it's a bit of a shame. I think Marty is probably one of the most fascinating characters I've ever seen. One of the first things we learn about him is his smug demeanor.
Oh, I was just a regular type dude with a big ass dick.
He's a very simple man, and one that Rust struggles to respect at first. While Rust has lost his family, Marty simply takes his own for granted. He constantly cheats on his wife with other women, most of whom he usually has power over, like in one instance where he tells a story about how he was arresting a woman and ended up using her for sex instead. It's almost to the point where he's motivated purely out of a macho sense of pride, and he doesn't quite know what he wants out of life. Men are supposed to get laid, so he gets laid. Men are supposed to have families, so he has a family. His actions are severely shallow, and because of this, he often judges Rust for his cynical view on life, almost blinded by his ignorance. Part of what makes Marty so fascinating to me is his dynamic with Rust. It's so fun watching these two bicker back and forth, and what little comedic dialogue there is still has so much meaning behind every word. Rust is a man who knows himself and simply doesn't like what he sees, but Marty is a man who blatantly ignores it and everything else around him, simply going along with what is normal and celebrated with no thought for himself or what he values in life. Many of his actions are impulsive and thoughtless, like when he finds out that the woman he's cheating with is having sex with another man and comes over to beat them to a pulp. Of course, this backfires and ends up horribly for him, with his wife leaving him and taking the kids, yet during all of it, he absolutely refuses to take accountability, always blaming others for his own mistakes and refusing to take no for an answer. There's also an aspect of Marty's character I find fascinating, and that would be his disdain for people who victimize teenagers. It's probably the most agreeable thing about him, and yet he still finds a way to distort it. One of the most fascinatingly complex conversations ever had in this entire show is the one where he and Rust visit some kind of rundown brothel service. One of the little girls almost confesses to being a prostitute in front of him, something that he finds genuinely horrible, and voices to her mother in a disgusted tone. But what's fascinating about this exchange is that it's hard to know who to root for in this argument. He talks about how a teenager should not be doing something like this, how this isn't the place for a kid, and how insidious and disgusting she is for victimizing her own daughter for profit, but the woman retorts by commenting on the dehumanizing and arrogant way that men dismiss sex workers as whores because of how threatened they feel that it's something they can't control, which cuts really deep for someone like Marty, given how misogynistic his actions often are. Both of them are right and wrong for their own reasons, but there's something that happens later in the season that adds even more shades of gray to this conversation. Marty eventually runs into that same little girl when she grows up into an adult, and she kind of puts him on a pedestal, almost seeing him as a knight in shining armor and believing that she owes him for the way he defended her when she was young. She's clearly a traumatized girl who doesn't know how to express herself without relying on the approval of men, and Marty ends up taking advantage of her, with no thought or regard for his now rekindled marriage. It's that sort of thoughtless arrogance that makes Marty such an enigma, and this extends to his own daughter as well. He sees her playing with toys and creating what looks like some sort of gang rape scenario with her dolls, and he completely averts his eyes. In fact, he never bothers to talk about it until his wife basically forces him to, and even then contributes very little to the conversation. Once she grows up a little bit and ends up sleeping with boys that are young adults while she's a teenager, he ends up talking to her in a very dehumanizing tone and even hits her without bothering to acknowledge her feelings. Time and time again, Marty is extremely disrespectful to his daughter, mocking her alternative style and repeatedly judging what he personally doesn't understand, even going to the extent to arrest those boys and beat them to a pulp himself instead of simply convicting them for statutory rape. Marty is a very self-serving man who justifies his own selfish actions by claiming they're a benefit to other people. If you could sum him up in any way, he's extremely delusional and narcissistic, and in some ways this bleeds into his work life. Though his wife Maggie is not much better. Rather than trying to understand why her daughter is fixating on sex at such a young age, she instead chooses to belittle her and tell her that her actions are ugly. In fact, she's often very insensitive to her own children, constantly telling them that their feelings don't really matter. But it's easy to understand, given how poorly she's been treated by Marty and how much is expected of her. He just views this whole marriage thing as a game, if anything. But Maggie is a very self-centered person too, with a lot of her actions feeling heavily inconsiderate of others. After she finds out that Marty's still cheating on her, she decides to get him back. But it can't just be some random stranger at a bar. No, She instead decides that his partner would be a much more hard-hitting betrayal, to the extent that she's even content with taking advantage of him while he's intoxicated, knowing full well how lonely and vulnerable he is and choosing to weaponize that. Then she tells Marty, knowing full well that it'll lead to him assaulting Rust. Though she may despise the man, in many ways, she's just like him, manipulative, conniving, selfish, and completely inconsiderate to those around her. But that's part of the beauty of True Detective. It acknowledges the egocentric attitude that we as human beings adopt, while putting on display just how far we're willing to take it. It asks the question of if those that we put our trust in to keep us safe are really all that different from the monsters that they hunt.
World needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door.
It's a brilliant and terrifying story. I mean, seriously, this show gives me fucking chills, and you don't even see what these cultists do, just the effects that it has on others.
Time is a flat circle.
I can't really talk about True Detective without acknowledging the theme of time being a flat circle. The first thing to even take note of is the jump back and forth between the present and the past, which is used to emphasize how our heroes have changed, and yet the world has not. It isn't so much a reflection of how history repeats itself, even though it often does, as it is a summary of Rust Cohle's vision of the world. At a certain point, he tries to explain M-theory and uses beer cans to replicate the rituals that were performed. The whole thing about M-theory is super complicated and not something even I can fully understand, but the point is that to Rust, everything happens in a sphere. It's almost a fourth wall break, considering this entire story can be viewed over and over again on a DVD and will probably remain timeless and relevant for years to come. It isn't so much that Rust will end up coming back to this case again, even though he does, as it is that cases like this will never go away. Things seem hopelessly futile, as humanity will always fall victim to its addiction to power. Every single time, a cop like Rust will find a man like Ledoux, and every single time, he'll find those kids in that room. No matter what happens, crime is never actually solved. Nothing is ever actually gained. We as human beings never actually learn. The best we have is simply catching the ones who commit such heinous acts, but it never addresses the idea of stopping it to begin with. It's also partly why Marty makes the same mistake twice as well. A man who repeatedly refuses to learn his own lesson until it's already too late. Much like Rust, he never fully understands him until he loses his family and then realizes that the future is behind him, that the good years came and went. It's a terrifying thought, realizing that your life is now an empty husk of what it used to be, that you spent it all blind and now have nothing to look forward to. That's what they mean by time being a flat circle. It isn't just a reflection of our flawed justice system, but also a cynical look at the human race as a whole and our failure to recognize our own flaws, how we as human beings contribute nothing, and as a collective can never actually achieve a peaceful world where crime doesn't exist. Even if we did achieve a peaceful utopia, it would be undone by someone just as quickly. The ritual would still commence, and that boy and girl will still be in that room over and over again until we as a species die out. The cult of True Detective is something that I still don't fully understand, and I think that's intentional. You never actually see their practices up close, but you know that they truly are the epitome of evil. I mean, they mostly seem to target little boys and girls, and much of their rituals appear to be religious. You're never actually shown up front what it is they do, but their presence still leaves an impact. Most of them wind up dead with antlers on their head, juxtaposing death to resurrection. Each year antlers grow and fall off, only to grow again the next year. Or it might be used to reduce the victim to an animal. The significance is never really known. I haven't really read The Yellow King, and I don't know much about Carcosa. That's probably something I can make a video about some other time. But the point is that this cult is easy to hate because they're pedophiles who target children. And again, you never really see what they do to children, only the way that they're affected. We at one point meet a jumpy crossdresser who comes to the disturbing realization that their terrifying nightmare from childhood wasn't really a dream after all, but that's one of the more tame examples. At one point, you see a little girl fighting like hell to try and remember what happened so she can help Rust find the culprit, but in the end, she has probably one of the most gut-wrenchingly horrifying panic attacks I've ever fucking seen. It leaves what she's endured up to the imagination. At another point, Rust and Marty talk to a woman with dementia who seems very lovable and kind, putting aside her traditional kind of toxic views on masculinity and the patriarchy. You can't really hold it against someone that old who seems to be suffering from dementia. This is probably one of the most terrifying scenes in the entire series because she's so normal until they show her Carcosa, and then she begins to recite the ritualistic chants.
Death is not the end. Rejoice.
You need to leave now.
Death is not the end.
You need to leave.
Realistically, I think that this image he showed her awakened a memory she had from these rituals, and she was merely reciting what they were saying, but her quote is really fascinating to me because it essentially sums up everything we brushed over. The distortion of time, the existential themes that permeate all throughout the show. But the phrase about death not being the end is something that unsettles Rust. He fears what might come for him after death, but it could have a second reading as well. That life goes on even after we die, and the cycle continues anew over and over again. This is also worn on the back of the central villain that Marty and Rust team up against, the man with the scars, an abuse victim that grew up to become an inbred pedophile. He was born in the darkness and embraced it fully, creating a ritualistic cross of skulls and branches, a depiction of the Yellow King. When we actually get a glimpse into his daily life, we find that there's a lot more wrong with him than we initially realized. He has some kind of incestual relationship and lives in a very filthy and decrepit environment, but once again he embodies the theme of time being a flat circle. His father abused him, so he retaliated by unleashing that same abuse 10 times over once he grew up. He was born a victim and became the perpetrator. He is the physical embodiment of this vicious cycle and the perfect villain for both Marty and Rust. It's difficult to know whether or not you can fault him given his childhood, but True Detective even takes the liberty of acknowledging that these actions are definitely learned and not inherent. There's another mentally ill man who gets caught masturbating in front of a preschool, and we come to find that this action in and of itself was a lack of social awareness. It wasn't something insidious that he did deliberately to traumatize people. It's likely that he did this out of habit, if anything, rather than any sort of actual gratification. He isn't a sick man, just misguided, and likely can't control himself. The man with the scars knows that his actions are wrong because he doesn't go about doing them just anywhere. Even despite how trashy his life is, it's clear he's kind of cold and calculated. See, it might seem like this has nothing to do with their dynamic, but that couldn't be further from the truth, because despite all their differences, the one thing that Marty and Rust have in common is a mutual disdain for people who hurt children. Rust is known for his interrogation skills, always knowing exactly what cards to play in getting a confession out of someone. One of the women he performs this on admits to killing her own baby, and he hits her with probably one of the most brutal lines I've ever heard.
The newspapers are gonna be tough on you. And prison is very, very hard on people who hurt kids. If you get the opportunity, you should kill yourself.
After his daughter died, it's easy to understand his disdain and disgust for those who hurt children. He represents the logical side of things, effectively setting her up to fail and moving on. Marty, on the other hand, is much more impulsive and emotional. We already went over his disgust at the underage prostitute, but he's also the one who kills Ledoux after finding those kids. Hell, he even quits the force after seeing a baby's corpse in a tweaker's microwave, deciding that he never wants to see anything that terrible ever again. Rust is logical, Marty is emotional, like a yin and yang dynamic. Yet even despite what both of them have seen, nothing prepared either of them for what Rust found on a VHS tape that he took from Reverend Tuttle's locker. We don't get to see what's on the tape, just Marty's reaction to it, which is pure terror, disgust, and rage. Whatever is on that tape, all we know is that it's much worse than a baby being burned to death in a microwave. That alone is the one thing that Rust and Marty share, a soft spot for children. The final episode of True Detective is off the wall and insane. The two of them take on this big burly man together, and in the end they end up killing him, but he doesn't go down without a fight, managing to severely injure both of them. I distinctly remember feeling worried and panicked at the thought that Rust might die, and for a second he almost does, but it turns out he recovers and afterwards hits a revelation. Death really wasn't the end of it, but it wasn't as cold or empty as he initially thought. There in that darkness, he felt the warm embrace of the daughter that he missed so much. For the very first time, Rust cries and opens up to someone else. He faces death with acceptance, only to then end up right back in the real world once again. Seeing his vulnerability, a side to him that Marty never saw before, he reminds him once again of the beauty in the world that they live in. Rust finally accepts hope, realizing that all of this is one continuous story. We're all connected in one way or another, and there's still hope in the face of futility. They didn't get all of the cult members, but they got theirs. They faced death head on, and came out on the other end with their lives. That alone is what changes Rust's view on the world. He realizes that there truly was a light at the end of the tunnel that he trudged through for years and years. Life truly does have a meaning, and if someone like Rust can see that, then so can we. It's something that you carve for yourself, taking it one little step at a time, bit by bit every day. Though they started as rivals, Marty and Rust confide in each other and end up depending on each other more than they initially figured they would. This tragedy has brought them closer together, and for a moment they're able to walk away from the hospital and continue their journey with a hopeful determination, bringing this brilliant season to a masterful close.